We're going to run this session to time if we possibly can. This is a very big subject, and I expect we'll be wanting to look at it again, and I hope you'll understand that we may need to ask you to come back at some later stage for further information about this very important subject. This is a huge sum of money by any standards, one of the biggest public spending decisions ever undertaken by a government. Can I begin by asking you, I don't know to whom I should address this question, which of you, how much did you charge for this?
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In terms of the questioning, perhaps it might help if I explain that I'm Head of Infrastructure Building and Construction at KPMG, and I'm ultimately responsible for any work that KPMG undertakes for High Speed 2. My colleague, Mr. Atter.
I head up our infrastructure strategy business, which seeks to connect economics, funding and financing and decision.
And in terms of your question, Mr. Chairman, the amount of the fee for the work was just under 200,000, including VAT on top. I think has been published at £242,000.
So the full cost is £242,000,
including the VAT. That's
and
correct.
there are no further costs.
For this piece of work, there are no further costs, Mr. Chairman. That's correct.
That are likely to fall to the government. Okay, thank you. I'd like to turn to the measure of productivity that is being used. Would you take the 15 billion figure that is in circulation, that is the 15 billion per annum benefit for the life of the project, which I think is 60 years. It's calculated on a 60-year basis. Is that a considered estimate, or is that something less than that?
I'd say it was a considered estimate. We've based our approach here on the best available evidence. We've asked the questions about what we can see in the real world in terms of difference in economic performance between cities, how much of that is explained by differences in connectivity, based on real world examples out there today, and we've asked what difference will HS2 make to that, and therefore what difference HS2 can make to the productivity of the UK economy. So it is very considered based on best available evidence today.
And so it's a reasonable forecast of what we might hope to get from this project?
We believe so.
The reason I use the word forecast is that I note that in several places you caution that a key part of your analysis is, and I quote, prepared for illustrative purposes only, and does not constitute a forecast. And a moment ago you've told me that this considered estimate is a forecast.
It's a considered estimate.
But it's no longer a forecast.
I think it is clearly a forecast.
Even though you are making clear that it does not constitute a forecast in your own report.
I think you're looking at our standard disclaimers.
So this is a standard disclaimer?
Yes.
So this standard disclaimer is written into something. If you're forecasting that tomorrow the sun will rise, you will nonetheless put a disclaimer on and say that's only a projection.
I think the conversation with risk and compliance might be more straightforward in that case, but yes.
So this is to stop you being sued?
Correct.
And you wouldn't want to say, therefore, that this is a forecast outside this room, and you're saying this because you're under parliamentary privilege, is that it?
I think in the sense of this discussion, it's a forecast.
Okay. Well, let's have a look at this 15 billion figure. Can I take you to page 84 of your report? What you've done here, as I understand it, is quite a complex calculation. You've tried to estimate the relationship between productivity and connectivity using 4 measures. the problem with all of these measures is you want to know whether the numbers you're getting are reasonably reliable and not just a rubbish in, rubbish out computer model. Correct?
Correct.
So you will have run a diagnostic test on all this.
We've run a number of tests on this. Perhaps if I step back a bit.
Well, perhaps you by all means step back in just a moment, but I just want to clarify a few points about these numbers. You ran a diagnostic test or series of tests on this?
Series of tests, yes.
Okay. And what did those tests tell you?
We ran a series of tests. Those tests told us, not surprisingly, that one of the things you need to worry about when you're looking at relationships like this is whether the one you're particularly interested in this case, the most important here is the impact that improving business connectivity by rail has on productivity. What you really need to be worried about in that context, particularly given the question that we're being asked here, what impact will HS2 have? What you really need to be worried about, given that question, is whether what you're seeing out there in the real world data, in terms of differences between business-to-business connectivity and differences between productivity, is solely a function of differences in business-to-business connectivity by rail, or whether it's actually partially a function of labour connectivity by rail, whether it's partially a function of road connectivity to businesses or road connectivity to labour. And against that background, and given the exam question we were posed, we said the most important elasticity in all of this is that between differences in business-to-business connectivity by rail and productivity. What we need to worry about is whether that elasticity is actually partly to do with other things. So we took that elasticity and we spread it across the other things. So we said, yes, this is our most important elasticity, but there is a risk that what we're seeing here is actually a function of differences in labour markets. It's actually a function of what's happening on the road network, both in terms of business connectivity and labour connectivity. So we spread that elasticity across the other impacts. Mm-hmm. That had the result of, transparently set out in our report, of more than halving the responsiveness.
This is the crucial piece of analysis lying behind the 15 billion figure, isn't it?
It's a very important part of it.
Well, it's the crucial, the most important single building block of the relationship between productivity, of the productivity measure, is the relationship between productivity and connectivity. And this, the coefficients for the connectivity will determine whether you get productivity.
I would agree, it's the single most important number in
right, okay. And so you've done those diagnostic tests, and what did they tell you?
They said that we needed an approach something like this one. We also discussed with the advisory panel the approach here, and they advised perhaps we should also look at some alternatives.
For everybody, the advisory panel?
HS2 appointed an expert advisory panel to assist.
So you went back to the advisory panel for
We've had a number
to seek advice.
We've had a number of conversations
on how to run your independent.
We had a number of conversations.
Analysis.
The panel is made up of independent experts.
Yeah.
We had a number of conversations with the panel about this approach and alternatives. Uh-huh. Some of the panel thought we should also address the issues, the statistical issues here, by blending our approach between measures of connectivity based on rail, measures of connectivity based on road, by forecasting a market share between them.
Okay.
Right? And you will find in our report we also show the impact of that approach, recognising that in using that approach, it's one of the challenges in this, you have to forecast road and rail market share.
Okay, you've told us before, a moment ago, that this is a forecast, that you have confidence in it, that it's robust, and you've told us just now that that figure is very heavily based on this piece of statistical work. Do you feel that piece of statistical work can be relied on?
I think in the circumstances and given the exam question we asked, I think it's a reasonable approach.
Do you think it's reliable? Do you think it's reliable?
If anything, it feels a little undercooked. I'll point out why.
What do you mean by undercooked?
It looks a little low.
Okay.
I'll point out why.
In other words, it is unreliable because it is too cautious.
I think it's conservative, yes.
Okay.
And
so
one of the
what
reasons
I'm trying to just get a very simple
correct. All right.
answer to a simple question, which is, do you think that we should be able to rely on this part of your statistical analysis for the purposes of assessing this project?
We are satisfied, given the questions that we faced and the nature of the data and the state of the art as we find it, that it is a reasonable approach.
Okay. Is it a reliable approach?
Well, we think it is.
Yes.
You think it is? It is a reliable approach?
That's right.
Yes.
If anything, it's on the low side.
Okay. I've understood that you're saying that if it's unreliable, it's because it's been biased in the conservative direction. Okay. So if anything, the middle point might be higher than this figure.
We thought it was only right, Mr. Chairman, the purpose of transparency, that we set out uncertainties, both positively and negatively.
We're going to come on to that in a moment. In later questions. Can I take you to page 83 of your report, paragraph 6.3.38? You've just told me that this approach is reliable and it is crucial to the analysis of the whole of this report. But you also say, and I'm quoting, we recognise that this approach does not have a firm statistical foundation.
Indeed.
So this is an approach which you think is reliable, but doesn't have a firm statistical foundation. Quite a tricky piece of territory to sit on, isn't it?
Against the background of the question we've been asked, the data that's available and the state of the art, we think all of this is reasonable. We've been very transparent about the adjustments that we have made to recognise the uncertainties here. Now, one of the standard approaches, I talked about this a few moments ago, in the face of these challenges, is actually use a blended measure of connectivity. So we will mix a measure of road connectivity with a measure of rail connectivity. But in order to undertake that mix, you have to forecast market share. So you have to forecast what road use is and what rail use is right the way across the network in a future year, and that future year is in the late 2030s. So you can, if you want, substitute this sort of approach for another one. The other one requires you to forecast market share with some accuracy in the late 2030s. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as a perfect
clarify where
approach.
we've got to this morning. You've agreed that the 15 billion figure per annum return for 60 years is a forecast and not just a projection.
It's a forecast of an annual impact in late 2030s. It might vary over those 60 years.
I'm just only summarising what you've just said, and you've agreed that that is heavily based on a piece of statistical analysis which you initially told me was reliable, and which your description of it as reliable you feel is consistent with what appears to be another disclaimer in your report, which is that this approach does not have a firm statistical foundation. To a layman, not just layman, that does seem something of a contradiction, Mr. Atter.
It is the nature of this particular beast. We've been very transparent about the adjustments that we've made to the elasticities that drop out of the analysis in light of the risk that the number you're seeing here is in practice reflection of other differences in connectivity. But can I also point out a couple of other important areas of conservatism in this analysis? This analysis, these elasticities, look at all places on an even basis. It's essentially an average relationship right the way across all the cities in the UK. Right? In practice, we strongly suspect, on the basis of analysis we've been doing subsequently, that the elasticities...
That's not published
Not
yet.
published here, but that actually the elasticities you see in respect of changes in connectivity for the most connected places, in practice, the places that would be impacted by high-speed rail are significantly higher than this,
Okay.
point one.
Okay.
Point two, on terms of conservatism, This analysis, as I said right at the beginning, is based on relationships between differences in connectivity and economic performance today.
Okay.
Right?
Perhaps it would be helpful if you could set out in writing for us after this meeting the first point in as much detail as you can.
Happy to do so.
That would be very valuable, because you're supplying information that's not been published on the basis of which we can't possibly comment. And if you want to add other points which are in the report, which I think the second point is in the report, that would be helpful. Could I just take you back to that sentence on page 83 before I pass the questioning on? It reads, it enables connectivity to other business and to labour by car and rail to be reflected in the analysis. So there appears to be a contradiction between the first half of this sentence and the second half of this sentence for estimating what the benefits will be for most of the rest of this century. What is the meaning of the last two words of that sentence?
I think there's a typo.
Okay.
To be reflected in the analysis and captured. The point here, if we go back to the...
Was there a bit more of this sentence there? Perhaps
I think
got
it was
cut?
In the analysis and captured rather than captures. I think it's a typo.
Okay.
Can I just...
Very briefly, but a lot of colleagues want to come in.
Absolutely. If we go back to what we did in respect of this key elasticity, right? We took the key elasticity and we divided it amongst the other measures of connectivity. What that allows you to do is look at the bit of the elasticity you took from business connectivity by rail, and we put it over here in respect of road, in terms of labour, in terms of road, in terms of business, and rail in terms of labour. So you've got that spread of elasticity sourced from one, spread across the others. And then you use those elasticities as and when something like HS changes labour connectivity by rail or connectivity by road.
Okay.
That's what that sentence means.
Okay, that's very helpful. David Ruffley.
I want to ask about the regional economic impacts, and just to explain what I'm most interested in, I just want to retail what Professor Henry Overman of the LSE, formerly an expert advisor to HS2 Limited, has said. When a firm is thinking of where to locate, it thinks about the relative productivity of different places and the relative wages. HS2 shifts that around, so if you're on the line that makes you a better place, that haven't had that productivity improvement, you will be in a better place. So that much is obvious. There'll be winners and losers. I just wondered, why were the figures on the cities that potentially could lose out as a result of HS2 omitted from your final report?
They're not omitted from the final report.
Well, I'm thinking the granular stuff that Newsnight extracted under an FOI request. Why wasn't that in the final version?
Well, if you look at page 54, there are two maps on page 54 that address the distribution of economic output that we're forecasting as a result of HS2. Very clearly, these maps have positive values in green, negative values in red.
But
I think we took the view that this was a very transparent and clear way of making the point that there were places that would win as well as places that would lose, and showing people where we thought those differences would be.
Well, just so I'm clear about this, the FOI request that Newsnight have produced, that isn't in the report, is it? And I'm asking you why not?
We thought this was the most appropriate way to explain this disaggregation, and in terms of the overall impact.
Why more appropriate? Because you had this information and it lists 235 areas, and just to take my own area as an example, and I'm referring to the FOI request that was not published. This is information you had and did not disclose willingly. Suffolk West, for instance, it argues there's a minus 1.4% fall in GDP, and that's the estimated change in output measured in terms of the potential impact of investment in HS2 on annual economic output for each area. So there's quite a granular set of losers here. And I just repeat the question. You gave us a map. Why didn't you produce the information that you had to hand?
If I
in the
may,
interests of openness and transparency. Mr. Threlfall.
I mean, if I may, Mr. Riley, we took a view that it was actually clearer to set out in the form of a map so that people could see visually where the impacts would be positively and negatively, rather than to publish a table of numbers which mixes up the 254 areas. And we supplied all of that data to HS2 so that if people asked for it, as they clearly did, it would be available. If somebody had asked us for the numbers, we would of course be happy to provide them. I mean,
That's okay, Mr. Threlfall. Was there pressure from HS2 Limited to leave out this much more granular information?
no, absolutely not.
Whose decision was it to leave out this granular information that the BBC had to ask an FOI request in relation to?
It wasn't a decision to leave out the data. It
Well,
was a deliberate decision that we thought it was actually a lot clearer to show the position on a map with red blobs for the negative
Mr.
impacts.
Whose decision was it? Who actually took the decision?
KPMG. We took the decision.
Who in particular?
I think I remember discussing with the team. We were looking for...
It was your decision, Mr. Atter.
Absolutely.
It was your decision. Okay. Now, the Taxpayers Alliance said it was, and I quote, utterly dishonest to have spent £250,000 of taxpayers' money on a report and then to release only cherry-picked findings. Mr. Threlfall, what would you say to that charge from the Taxpayers
I'm
Alliance?
going to say we would completely reject that charge. We think
You
we
did
have
not
been,
cherry-pick.
We did not cherry-pick the results.
You did not cherry-pick.
We think we have gone out of our way in this report to be as transparent as we could possibly be. We have been transparent about the methodology, even returning to the prior exchanges about recognising some of the limitations in the methodology, some of the upsides and the downsides. We've been very transparent about the assumptions, and we've been very transparent about the output to the report and captured them as maths.
Okay. Now, your report states, and I quote, the analysis is based on data and assumptions used to support the August 2012 iteration of the economic case. Can I ask, were you asked to update your analysis to reflect the changes in assumptions made for the October economic case?
This report was clearly published in September, so
Yeah.
it predates the...
I'm asking you, were you asked to update?
We have not yet.
Not formally, no. We're discussing whether that would be a sensible thing to do.
It's clearly a matter for HS2 if they now ask us to update this report in the light of the new assumptions.
So you're waiting for HS2 to give you an instruction?
And for the data. We don't have the data.
And for
to
the
do that.
data. That's helpful. Now, how significant an impact do you think the changes in the data and assumptions for the October 2013 iteration would have on your analysis? And we're just going to have a general feeling. Mr. Threlfall. Sorry, you were.
Yeah, it's a bit.
You were conferring there.
It's a bit speculative at this time. We see some areas.
I'm asking you to not be speculative, but an educated guess. You're both very experienced analysts.
We understand, but we have not seen the details. That
what your understanding is?
Understand that the new analysis of routes, services, and the rest of it has additional effort into use of freed up capacity. Right? And if efficient use has been made of freed up capacity, we would expect overall productivity impacts to increase. We also know that whereas the 2012 version did not have the station at Manchester Airport, the 2013 one does, both of those things would suggest that the economic benefits will increase. There may be things in the service pattern we don't know about that would reduce the number, but we don't know about.
So your provisional view, without having seen all the data, because it's not been supplied to you in detail, it's upside, no downside.
I think there's upside in the train plan, but there are other things. Also,
what are the other things?
You'll notice that the Department of Transport has revised its value of time for business use. It's decreased it by about a third. we ran a sensitivity on this analysis, reducing it by half. When we reduced it by half, the net economic gain per annum was 12 billion, not 15. Department of Transport is reduced by a third. We would expect that impact in isolation to have reduced the overall number. But there are other things that would push the number up again, because when this initial analysis was undertaken, we hadn't looked at labour participation, we hadn't looked at the international dimension, we hadn't looked at freight. Again, those things would put it up. The list of things that would put the number up is longer than the ones we know about that would reduce it.
That's useful. I'm just wondering when this further work might be done. It sounds to me as if you're just answering questions to order, that you're answering the questions that HS2 put to you, or the work they ask you to do. Don't you think it might be a good idea to suggest to them that this might be need updating along the lines you've just rather helpfully set out?
We have indeed done that, and there's a section of the report that discusses areas for further work.
When do you think that work might be done?
We're discussing that with HS2 at the moment.
No, but roughly, how quickly do you think?
There are a number of things that need to be done. It would take a matter of months.
Right. I've just got
one
one
very
final
quick and
question.
a very quick reply.
Your report says that it's based upon publicly available information provided to KPMG LLP by HS2 Limited. My simple question is, did you seek to challenge any of the information on costs and benefits provided to you by HS2 at all, if you thought any of the information might be a bit iffy or unclear or nebulous? Did you query Mr. Threlfall?
The cost of constructing HS2 has nothing to do with this analysis. In terms of the data we were provided, we asked deep questions of detail and clarification of it, and as I explained earlier, we did some sensitivity tests. So we did a test, for example, that halved the standard value of time for business users on rail.
Thank you.
Stuart Hosey.
Indeed. Can I go back to the Chairman's initial question about the web benefits, the wider economic benefits of this being 15 billion a year by 2037? Why did you not discount the figures to give a present value?
To discount the figures to present value, we'd have to forecast not just 2037, but every year from 2036 out to, 60 years or so beyond 2037.
So you felt this was the most accurate figure you could come up with?
The issues that go to what the impact on the real economy of high speed really boil down to what do you think the impact would be when the system is mature. Right? Everything else is variations on that theme. Does the 15 billion go up over time? Is it flat? Does it go down? Key question is it 15 in the first place? And to address that, we focused on a snapshot year, a reasonable number of years after the system had opened.
Okay, I'll set aside the fact that the whole analysis appears to be out with the standard Green Book approach, and so it's difficult to compare it with what otherwise might have been concluded. However, you said earlier the estimates were undercooked, they were conservative, they were on the low side, if anything. In a sense, it's good to hear you say that. However, the experts in the field, like Professor Dan Graham at Imperial College, have said the 15 billion figure, quote, seems to be on the optimistic side, which rather contradicts. So why is an academic saying that appears to be on the high side, while you're suggesting these figures are undercooked on the low side?
You'll have to put that question to them.
Well, I'm putting it to you.
I suspect if we take some of the questions that have been asked about this analysis go to labour market impacts and quality of labour. That's a particular interest and area of expertise of Henry Overman, for example. Now, his analysis has in the past suggested that a lot of labour market impacts that you see on the back of investment are not a function of the size of the effective labour market, but its quality. All right? Now, and given that, he's posed questions about whether these numbers are overcooked. In response, actually, market impacts are a very small part of our overall number. It's less than 1 billion of the 15. But there are a number of different perspectives on aspects of this analysis that people bring to bear, and it leads them to take different views about it. I think that's inevitable.
That's helpful. Can you tell the committee, is your method of assessing the regional impact benefits entirely new, or have you drawn on the work of others in working that out, in the calculations?
We've looked at work of others. We also had lengthy conversations with HS2 and the expert panel, and we sat back and asked the fundamental question here. And it's part of the rationale for the way we did the work.
But as you said earlier, the rationale you used was basically averages across the economy, rather than looking at the impact in specific areas. Is that correct?
No, the responsiveness, the elasticity between changes in connectivity and productivity, right, that's one that this analysis averages. Right? In terms of the impact on individual places, right, what is driving that is a combination of things. One, it is how much more productive does HS2 make one place versus another place. The other thing that's driving that is what we have done through HS to lower the barriers to trade and competition between them. Right? Because not only does HS make individual places more competitive, and by different amounts, it also lowers the barriers to competition between them by lowering the cost of travel between them. Right? It's why our analysis started with productivity. It said, right, step one, what difference have we made to productivity across the country? Step two, how does that change national cake on the back of those productivity gains now divide up differently? It divides up differently on the basis of what we have done to what the ability of one place to compete with another for business. Right? And it's that second bit where essentially we built a model, a number of versions of it, that says, right, what do we think drives competition between cities? Function of what the labour costs are, what their productivity is, but also what the costs of trade between them are. Right? So we built the model, a number of versions of it, that asked that question. We calibrated that model to today, and then asked the question, given those relationships, what difference will HS2 make?
And which part of that model, or which part of your analysis are you least confident about?
That analysis is challenging because what it really is asking about is trade between places, and there are no trade statistics between places.
But you say it's challenging. If I go back to the granular figures that David roughly had, which showed Aberdeen and Dundee potentially losing out on a low business case scenario, taking into consideration everything you've said about elasticity and about trade between cities, for Dundee and Aberdeen, Dundee and Angus and Aberdeen, to lose out in the way the low business case scenario implied, would require trade from Aberdeen, serving the North Sea, for example, with a fixed base, to be served from somewhere near Birmingham because it had a rail line to London. It would require people working in the life sciences industry in Dundee University to be served from somewhere near Leeds because it had a fast railway line to London. That doesn't really seem to add up to me.
That's, of course, the Scottish economy today. Right? This is asking questions about the UK economy in 2037. It's a different place. But we acknowledge that one of the things on our, if you like, to-do list is the international dimension to this. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is very clearly unique about Aberdeen is North Sea oil. That's a kind of national external dimension to this, and it's on our, as we identified earlier, to-do list in terms of the further work.
So when you say identified requirement to do further work, I get the impression you're not dreadfully convinced by some of this analysis.
At the overall level, at the regional level, yes. In terms of individual places where there are is a significant international dimension, there would be a question mark.
John first.
Just a very quick question, if you can help me. To what extent in your report do you take account of modal shift and the potential pluses or minuses that may come from that?
In our central analysis, we do not rely on forecasts of mode share, but what we do have in our central analysis is the forecast impact by HS2 of HS2 on road congestion. Right? So there is an impact as a result of reduced road congestion in our numbers. That reduced road congestion comes about as a result of HS2's forecast of transfers from road to
As
road.
far as road congestion goes, you're taking it straight from HS2?
Correct.
And what about freight, rail freight?
As I said, it's one of the areas that this analysis does not yet address.
Sorry?
It's one of the areas this analysis does not yet address.
And it's one of the areas where it suggests the numbers are understated today because we haven't had a chance yet to look at the freight
Because
impacts.
it's quite a big plus or minus, isn't it?
It's a big plus.
It's a plus, it must be a plus.
Yeah, it must be. Right, thank you.
Jesse Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I just ask you, Mr. Threlfall, how many people did you employ on this piece of research from KPMG?
There were more than 6 will have had.
We think about 6, and in addition, as I think we've said in the report, we subcontracted Connected Economics, and there was an individual from that organisation as well involved in the work.
And were they? And so that was included within the fee you charged? Was the additional
It was indeed,
subcontracting?
yes, that's included in that fee.
And how many days do you think of work has been done on this report by your team?
Well, the work extended over approximately 4 months from when we started, which would be in April, through to when we concluded and started to wrap up the work at the back end of August. I'd have to go away and, it would be possible to go away and give you exact details from our timesheets on hours and so on, if you wish.
And did you have senior people involved in it, or were they all junior people?
We most certainly had senior people. We had a lot of senior oversight in the work. It was important to the firm that we looked as carefully as possible at the results that we were producing. I had oversight, and so did other colleagues in the firm.
And would you describe this as a small or a medium or a large size project for your organisation? In terms of this kind of analysis?
In fee terms, it's relatively small. In terms of, I suppose its impact, seems to have had quite a lot of discussion.
No, in terms of the amount of commitment of time, that's what I'm thinking about, for this kind of analysis. Is this on the high end of the amount of time you would spend to do a piece of economic
of this sort?
Forecasting?
I think, as Lewis has already said, there's more work to be done, but it was a very intensive piece of work over the period of the 4 months that we did it.
I'd be grateful if you could write to us with the details of how
We could certainly do that.
I'd be grateful. So my question is, how can you charge as little as £200,000 for such an enormous piece of work over 4 months involving lots of senior people with junior support? It seems to me an extremely low number. Or were you pricing your partner's time at a very low level?
I think we had a long debate when we were competing for the work, because obviously it was competitively tendered back in March, April. We took a view as to the fee which we thought would secure the work for us. It was a piece of work I think that we were intellectually interested in. I think it's one of the challenges of our organisation that we're intellectually interested in some of this stuff as well as trying to earn money from it.
I mean, you expected some future revenue from the client, potentially?
Potentially. Equally, the team that I lead that does this, as Lewis well knows, is sold out across a number of pieces of work. So if we didn't do this, we'd be deploying the same team on other things.
But you were really buying the work from the government at a cheap price in order to do future work when they came on board with HS2, weren't you?
No, I don't think we were buying the work. In practice, the rates at which we do this work will tend to be the same from one piece of work to another.
Okay. Good. We'll look into that. Thank you. Mr. Atter, Mr. Atter, you said you caveated your answers to the chairman by saying, subject to the questions we were asked. What questions should you have been asked?
It's one of the challenges in all of this is that we're looking at HS2 in isolation. It's the impact of this project using this methodology in a future year. So some of the questions one might like to have been asked, had there been time and had it been a practical proposition, would be how this compared to alternatives.
Right. So you'd have liked more option generation around what the alternative to HS2 would have been.
In an ideal world, yes, but the problem is that's actually quite a challenging question. This is a project that's delivered over 20 years.
Right.
What you'd be asking in terms of alternatives is what the alternative programs would be over 20 years. I mean, just to scale that for you, government expenditure on capital runs at 50 billion a year, 3% of GDP. Right? This is a 20-year project. While this project is being delivered, on that 3% a year, total public expenditure on capital will be £1.2 trillion. Right? To ask how this compares to the alternatives means asking how this compares to more than £1 trillion of as yet unspecified investment.
Right, I understand.
Major challenges.
Were you in a hurry to complete the work?
We were interested in moving as quickly as was prudent, in part because actually there needs to be a debate about this.
Do you think there's been adequate debate if parliamentarians get this report 2 days before the vote?
Publication date was not our answer. We didn't know that vote was coming. It wasn't the date for publication wasn't out.
But the answer you're making is essentially no. Impossible to assess this piece of work, which took you 4 months to put together, in 2 days, and reach a responsible decision on the merits.
It would be a challenge, yes.
Thank you. On the benefit-cost ratios that you've offered, am I right in thinking that they require these wider economic benefits in order to hit the targets you wanted? Is that right?
We're not doing benefit-cost ratios here. This is I think it's a fundamental point we need to recognise in all of this. This is very, very, very different from standard Department of Transport Green Book cost-benefit appraisals. All right? This is asking not about time savings. This is asking about productivity and output in the economy, relaxing a lot of the restrictive assumptions that the Department of Transport makes. So, for example, standard approach to Department of Transport holds land use fixed. Right? So a transport scheme, whatever it is, will not change where people live, won't change where the jobs are, won't change the kind of jobs they do. We relax all of that. Yep. We don't count time savings. We focus in on what we think is the fundamental first-order issue, with impact on GDP.
Would this proposal, without that wide economic benefit analysis, pass a Green Book evaluation?
It's very different.
It's different from the Green Book. If I may address what I think might have been a confusion. Sorry, Mr. Norman.
No, stop. I'm asking a question, a follow-up to my previous question of Mr. Atter, which is whether or not, as a former Treasury official, he can answer this question, whether this would have passed a Green Book appraisal as it was, without this extra thing. We can then come on to the question of why.
It's not a Green Book appraisal. It was never designed to be a Green Book appraisal.
Right. But the reason why you've done this is because of a concern that the Green Book approach wouldn't capture the benefits as you see them, or as they were suspected of existing to the project.
That is fair.
And potentially the costs as well.
Well, we haven't looked at the cost side of the equation.
Okay. You haven't looked at the costs?
No.
Okay. Why have you adopted? I mean, the effect of this approach is it not to make this project non-comparable with any other project, because for no other project has this analysis been done?
I think it is true to say that no other national project has been looked at it this way. It is not true to say that projects on a regular basis aren't looked at like this. If you ask how any of our major cities addresses the impact of transport and the benefits and costs of transport, whether it's a Greater Manchester, a Leeds, a Sheffield, a Birmingham, a Glasgow, all of them are increasingly looking at transport through this real economy lens. Right? So it is not the case that this sort of approach is not widely used. It is widely used, just not by central government.
Okay, it's been independently estimated. You've said that the 15 billion of future national benefit, in your judgment, is an understatement, if anything, given other sources of potential revenue as you see them, future revenue.
That's our current view, yes.
So we've had an independent estimate that the net present value of that 15 billion is 256 billion. That is to say, the project returns something like 5 times its capital cost. Can you see why, since that's a spectacularly high number, there might be some concern as to whether or not that's true?
That's yeah, it sounds like a discounted cash flow calculation.
Right.
It would depend on the details. Remember, this is an estimate for 1 year. To produce a discounted view of that, you would
Right,
have
but
to
you're not
ask.
suggesting that the benefits end in year 2?
Certainly not.
So the central case for future projections is going to be the year at which you made the calculation?
Absolutely.
Right.
I
So it's not inappropriate then to discount that
I wouldn't be
as a
surprised.
central case in a fan of potential alternatives?
We haven't run those numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were of that order.
Right. If it was 256 billion or something close to, you would agree that that would be a spectacularly high return from a project like this?
It's a good return.
Yeah, kind of out of any proportion to expectations.
I think it's indicative of the transformational nature of putting an entire new railway line through the country.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I may just clear up what I think might have been a confusion in one of the earlier questions. Our report was published on the 11th of September, and I believe the report that Mr. Norman was referring to previously was the economic assessment and strategic case published by HS2 last week.
Yeah, right.
Yes, absolutely right. And
That's helpful.
Thank you for that
Thank you.
clarification. Just to clarify what you're going to send us on the work you've done, it would be very helpful if we could see a reasonable breakdown of the timesheets. I realise that that's something that, to some degree, you'll be reluctant to divulge, but there will be aspects that a client might reasonably want to see when deciding whether to pay a bill. In this case, the bill has gone to the public
There is no
sector.
sensitivity on our side to do providing that information.
This has been before your risk assessment committee, presumably.
It went through a number of risk assessment hurdles. That is absolutely correct, yes.
And what you were weighing, presumably, was a relatively low initial return against the, hopefully, good publicity by being associated with a project of this type. Well, you don't normally do work of this scale for a couple of 100,000, do you?
I don't think we actually did weigh it up in those terms. I mean, the rates that we did this at are our public sector rates, so in that sense it is just the rate for the time. We estimated the time that it would take us to do the work, and that was the fee. We were in competition, and so we tried to work out how we could do the work most efficiently. And I don't think we quite anticipated the degree of debate that the report would create.
I just want to go back to some replies from Mr. Atter, where he, I thought, very sensibly set out the difference between the Green Book approach and the approach you're taking. The former based on trying to estimate time savings and safety, and the approach you took based on land values and wage rates, and the effect, therefore, by that means on overall GDP. But you have told us, haven't you, that these estimates of land values and wage rates, and I'm quoting again, page 83, do not have a firm statistical foundation.
We are saying that there is no perfect way of addressing the exam question that we were posed in doing this work. We have very transparently set out what we believe is a reasonable, probably conservative approach to getting at key questions.
Okay. Mark Garnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I sort of step back from your report and ask a few more sort of philosophical questions, if I may, and your opinion on just infrastructure in general? My first question is, why is this taking 20 years to build?
I mean,
Or put it another way, does it need to take 20 years to build?
clearly it wasn't part of our remit to comment on the time it takes to build. I mean, the time it takes to build is no doubt a combination of physically how long it takes to work out, and a combination of how quickly you want to spend the money. But ultimately, that's a matter for the government and high speed too.
And the time it necessary to secure the powers.
I mean, let me ask another question then. Why do you think the government has to pay for this? And why isn't it being put out to private tender for infrastructure companies that may find this an attractive opportunity to source yield, which, as we know, yield at the moment is something quite difficult to find?
I mean, I think that's a good question, and I'm sure there will be a lot of work still to be done about the extent to which some form of private finance can come into this. But clearly, the financing of the project is a different matter from ultimately paying for it, and ultimately paying for it, which is really what this debate is about, can only be met by the taxpayer or the user in some combination. But again, that wasn't part of what we were asked to look at.
No, I appreciate that, but you're both experts. I mean, Mr. Threlfall, you lead on the corporate finance infrastructure business at KPMG, and Mr. Atter, you have your policy, economics, funding and financing of this stuff. This is a 50 billion pound project. Presumably there must be plenty of people in the private sector who will see this as a great opportunity. Why is this not being considered? Why do you think it's not being considered?
Well, I don't think the detail of exactly how this will be financed has been completely worked through yet. There's a lot more work to be done on that. But in terms of magnitude, a project of this scale would be quite a big undertaking for the private sector to undertake, certainly purely on its own risk. I mean, certainly in all of the experience and work that I've done, as soon as you get over a number of 2 or 3 or 4 billion, then you really start to stretch the willingness of the private sector to do that, certainly through the construction period. I mean, if you look at what was done on High Speed 1, that was essentially in the end taken forward by the public sector and then sold back into the private sector once it was an operational project. That would be a perfectly reasonable consideration option, if you like, for this project.
With the length of time it's taken to build it, I mean, as I understand it, you start at Euston and you just roll relentlessly forward until you hit Stuart's part of the world in Scotland, and which is why it takes 20 years. I mean, surely, if it is so valuable an asset for the economy of this country, surely you could build it in 10-mile sections or 100-mile sections, or start at each station and build in those directions and use it. Would that just not be a better way of doing it?
I think those are legitimate questions. We haven't looked at them, but they are legitimate questions. I mean, it's one of the things I think the Growth Task Force is looking at, for example, is in thinking about the detail of how you deliver this. In terms of that detail, how do you maximise the value? And those sorts of questions, I would see as being a legitimate part of that kind of conversation.
But my final question: in your opinion, if it is worth £15 billion a year in economic GDP impact in 2037, then it must be worth doing it quicker. If it is that valuable a project, actually surely somebody must come to the conclusion it's worth doing it quickly rather than having a 20-year build period.
I mean, my personal view on this, Mr. Garnier, is that based on the work that we've done, clearly in economic and financial terms, High Speed 2 is a good thing, and we should get on with it. The way I tend to look at it is we should imagine ourselves in 2050. We should imagine what it feels like to be in a country with another 15 million more people in the country.
Quite a lot of us will be dead by then, of course.
And you should imagine what it would be like trying to get around this country if we hadn't made this sort of investment.
And my own view on this is, I started by thinking about high-speed rail as an ex-Treasury official, and clearly I started in the sceptical camp, given its scale and cost. However, over time, the more I've looked at this, the more I've asked myself the question, on a 20-year view, do you see a comprehensive solution to the north-south divide that doesn't have something like this as part of it? And I'm afraid I don't. And in the context of a 20-year programme, back to that earlier number, total in public sector investment over that 20 years would be of the order of 1.2 trillion. So the question about this isn't, is this the very best thing to do? It's, would you find space for it within 1.2 trillion pounds if what you were after was a comprehensive solution to the north-south divide? Against that background, deep breath, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming to see us this morning. We may want to see you again at some future date, but in the meantime you're going to send us some written material in the light of some exchanges. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 5-minute interval and begin again at 10:28.